Hello and welcome to Beth Rigby Interviews, where I speak to people who have something to say about the world today and how it's changing. This week, two leaders in their professions with strong views on the biggest stories of the moment, the NHS and trust in policing. Lord Winston has dedicated much of his working life to healthcare and is alarmed by the current crisis in the NHS. He says the government's lost control, needs to increase funding and workers' pay to stop the strikes making it worse. And Britain's first black police and crime commissioner, Festus Akinbusoye, on why it's time to take complaints against officers more seriously to rid the force of criminals, plus how he's dealt with racist abuse for being a Conservative. First, though, the world-renowned embryologist Lord Winston, now in his 80s, he's spent decades in healthcare and says the current NHS crisis is the worst he's seen. So what solutions should the government be looking at? Lord Winston, thank you for coming on our show today. Now, the NHS is never out of the headlines at the moment, and the thing I wanted to start off asking you is how big a crisis do we find ourselves in today when it comes to our health service?
I think it's a very real, very serious crisis. I don't think we've certainly... I qualified in medicine in 1964, and there's never been a crisis like that since. And I think it's a bit like a battle. You know, when you start to lose control of the battle, that's when it gets really bad. And what's happened now, of course, is the government's actually lost control. What
do you mean when you say they've lost control?
Well, when you have ambulances queuing outside hospitals, when you've got people dying unnecessarily, unfortunately, when you see people with heart attacks and with cancer not being treated on time, I mean, that is actually losing control of healthcare.
So when Keir Starmer says he thinks it's the worst crisis in the NHS's history, he's not making a political point, you don't think? You think that that is the truth?
I'm sure. And, you know, I know I sit on the Labour benches in the House of Lords, but, you know, really, I see myself really as more a crossbench in mind. But, I mean, Keir Starmer's absolutely right. He's completely trustworthy. And I don't have any doubt that really what he's saying is really from the heart.
And Lord Winston, the government, you know, I talk to ministers about this and to Number 10 about what's going on. They often talk about the legacy of COVID, that has compounded the problems, that's created these huge waiting lists, people not going in to see doctors during those 2 years where the pandemic really absorbed the whole attention, not just of the country, but the health service, obviously. That there is some truth in that, isn't it? It's not entirely...
I would put it a different way. I would say that the government have been incredibly lucky with COVID, because actually, in fact, this, in fact, gave them a perfect excuse not to do things, and they've been sitting complacency while this has been going on. So COVID has directed everything. And actually, this crisis was inevitable without COVID. There's no question about that. It was absolutely clear.
Okay.
If you look at the graphs of everything going up, they're going up almost in a linear fashion. Waiting lists, ambulance problems, people dying, people not getting diagnoses, right the way through for years before COVID. So this has been a long-term problem, and it's been going on at least for 10, 12 years, probably longer. And it's been clear that there has been massive underfunding of the health service.
So, Lord Woods, just to be clear, your view is that COVID has given the government cover to blame underlying problems?
No question. And in fact, don't forget, they were warned about COVID. We had the select committee I sit on in the House of Lords, Science and Technology, had repeatedly pointed out there was bound to be a pandemic.
When Keir Starmer then says, I don't want to talk about funding, that is dishonest, isn't it? Because isn't that partly what a political leader should talk about? And it is disingenuous to say it's all about reform, it doesn't need more money.
I'm not prepared to say that Keir Starmer's dishonest. If he says I'm not going to talk about the funding, it may be because his views on the funding are currently fluid.
Right.
And in fact, I think that actually we should have that fluid view. And I think that's reasonable. And I think, in fact, if we ever get round to having a cross-party agreement, it's not going to come very easily, because neither side is going to want to sit down like this, because actually whoever does this could lose a huge number of votes. But actually, we have to start thinking, not politically, but actually in terms of what really is needed. And that's a very big difference.
Sort of thinking the unthinkable,
yes,
if you like.
Look, we know from the First World War, if you fight a battle politically, you lose it. And that's what the politicians did on both sides. Large numbers of lives were lost on the German and the English side because the politicians were trying to direct the war. And actually, this is the same sort of thing. We've got to really look about what is really needed in terms of managing a proper healthcare system.
Do you personally think that the NHS does need more resource and more funding?
Yes.
People are scared about talking about this, aren't they? Because they're wary that reform is code for diluting the principle of the NHS being free for all. This is a political issue, isn't it, in that sense?
It's an issue we should deal with some humility, isn't it? That's really what we need to do, and actually recognise that nobody has a perfect answer. But actually, one thing we could certainly do is to look at systems which are better than our NHS. You know, for years we have boasted that the NHS is the best healthcare system in the world. Doctors will tell you that it's not. The doctors who go outside this country, and many of them do, I've worked in the United States, I've worked in Europe, I've had jobs in Belgium, for example, I've been in the front line in other countries. And actually, there are many examples across Europe in particular, but also elsewhere, where in fact there is better care than we're giving. And we have to understand ourselves, what have we done that could have been done? What do we do now to try and do that? It means a change in the way that we do things. It doesn't mean to say that we don't want to see healthcare for everybody. Of course we do. That is a reasonable, proper entitlement in a good democracy. But it needs to be done fearlessly, and it's going to have to be very difficult to do. I don't doubt that.
Lord Winston, I actually interviewed Sajid Javid, the former Health Secretary, at the end of last year, and we touched upon this, and he said, we need to talk about the funding of the NHS. And then I said, well, what particular model? Do you like France? Do you like Germany? What are you looking at? And he didn't want to discuss that. And he basically said that no one can talk about this because they are shouted down. I think you're saying that that needs to end, but do you accept that that probably cannot happen until after a general election?
You know what? That's what happened to me in the year 2000 when I was shouted down by Alistair Campbell. And Tony Blair came back on the phone and said, you know, you're quite right, we're going to increase the funding. And he did, massively. And, of course, Blair had a very large majority. May well be that the next government will have a very large majority.
Is this a call to Keir Starmer, then, in a way, to kind of show some
Yes,
courage?
I would love to talk to Keir, because I have a huge regard for him now at the moment. It's very clear that this government is burnt out. So there's every reason why we should be thinking about what we would do if we did have a massive majority and start to try to persuade that.
You talked about other countries use hybrid systems of public funding and private insurance. Is that what you think the UK needs?
Well, I'll tell you what, you know, had we done what I wanted when the Labour government was in, to really bring private practice into the NHS hospitals so that we had not private clinics in Harley Street, but private clinics actually in our main central hospitals, and really where consultants no longer had to drive out to a private clinic, but would go next door, and you wouldn't have a differential treatment because they wouldn't treat patients differently. But there are still hospitals where that happens, for example. But on the whole, it doesn't really happen very much. And a huge amount of income has been lost as a resulting consequence because of a dogma associated with private practice.
Just in terms of other areas of reform, because Labour are talking about reorganisation, Keir Starmer has suggested more self-referral. Now, you are you were a practitioner, you're an expert. Do you think that's a good idea, that people self-refer? Or is that just time wasting because it's unwise referrals?
I think it's
something...
something...
He said people with self-bleeding, internal bleeding could refer.
Well,
I mean, don't you need to go to A&E if you've got internal bleeding?
Well, I think it's difficult to understand quite what he meant. But, I mean, if he meant that, you know, just being aware of symptoms earlier and then for doing something about it, I would agree with that. If you mean self-referral in terms of how most doctors seem to perceive it, and you saw them on the news, they were horrified. I'm not clear quite what he had in mind there, to be fair, and I think that's quite important too. But we should have more healthcare information available, and I think we do need a more robust primary care system, and at the moment that's not adequate either. So, for example, we have very good general practitioners, but more and more people, as soon as they get to a reasonable age, leave. So the loss of retention of workers in the health service is scandalous, and it's because of the very poor circumstances and the fact that they're not actually not being listened to.
Well, actually, I might as well bring this up now. I mean, now you've brought it up, just quickly, I don't want to make this into a news interview, but nurses' pay, doctors' pay, ambulance workers' pay. Does the government need to move on this?
Yes.
You think they do?
Of course. We're not paying nearly enough.
And is that affecting retention? I mean, what about the argument about inflationary pressure?
If a nurse can walk out of a NHS hospital one day and walk into a private clinic the next day with an increased, not only increased salary, but just better working conditions, being treated in a more human way. I mean, but having working hours which are acceptable and being able to work part-time, perhaps, whatever it might mean. I mean, we've not been that flexible. We've been better at that. But if you saw the nurses on the news yesterday. It makes you cry to see them crying, to see them shouting and screaming in that sort of way. That kind of angst, that is not usually shown by nurses. And doctors feel that just as much, but they probably don't say it quite so loudly. I think there's been a great deal that could be done with pay. Certainly the pension reform is really urgently needed. That's clearly iniquitous. But there are other things that could be done as well. Yeah, I think we have to pay people what their value to society is.
And we value the NHS greatly.
And we value the NHS greatly. That means that we have to actually consider what it's really worth to us.
And Lord Winston, Labour this week also revealed figures showing that 37,000 people with conditions like heart attacks or strokes, a Category 2 call as it's described, waited more than 3.5 hours for an ambulance in December. I mean, what happens if, what happens? I mean, I don't know, but if you have to wait an hour for an ambulance and you've got a suspected stroke or heart attack, what happens to that person?
Well, you lose part of your brain, which dies, possibly, and of course you then have irreparable damage, so you are a much bigger cost to the health service the rest of your life, which may be diminished, of course.
So when you see those ambulance figures...
It's not saving money, it's actually costing money. It's actually costing money to keep stroke people waiting. Nobody's ever said that before, but it's obviously true.
Well, so just to finish off, and thank you for spending so much time talking to me, but what's your message then to political leaders right now?
Well, I would like to just hear honesty, I think. I'd like to see honesty at the dispatch box, and when they're asked questions, we're not getting that enough. I think we all have to be honest, because nobody has the answers. And I think we really need a degree of humility. We can't keep on boasting about healthcare. There are pockets of really fabulous stuff going on. At the moment I'm under the care of Moorfields Hospital, seeing 2 different consultants as an NHS patient, and they're brilliant. You think this is world-class stuff. It is, but the support for them, because of the paperwork and so on, is really not adequate. And you feel it's so shocking that really we have these pockets, but the health service is not delivering what it could do, and that needs really careful reorganisation and the use of better data too, better data management.
And as a private citizen, a person that's worked in the NHS that's given so much to this country in terms of innovative healthcare, you would pay more tax for a better NHS?
Of course, no question.
OK. Lord Winston, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure and honour to meet you, so thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lord Winston there, describing what he and many others believe is the worst crisis in the NHS's history. Well, next week, we'll be asking if the health service can survive. I'll be part of a special programme debating the NHS's future, live from the University Hospital in Coventry. It's next Thursday, the 26th of January at 7 p.m, so do tune in. And if you'd like to be part of the live audience at the hospital, scan the QR code on your screen right now or email nhscrisis@sky.uk. Now, we often hear about the American dream, but what about success stories here in Britain? My next guest knows what it's like to work your way up from the bottom. Aged 13, a military coup forced his family to leave Nigeria and start a new life in the East End of London. They had little money, but against the odds, that 13-year-old has gone on to become Britain's first black police and crime commissioner. Earlier this week, I sat down with Festus Akinbusoye. We discussed his journey into the role, the racism he suffered along the way, and one of the top stories of the week, trust in policing. Festus Akinbusoye, thank you so much for coming on Beth Rigby Interviews. Now, you're a very interesting man with a very interesting future. You are the country's first black police and crime commissioner. What does that achievement mean to you?
For me, it means that actually this is a country where anything is possible. I remember some people saying to me, with a name like Festus and Akinbusoye, no one will vote for you. And they were wrong. I ended up winning the highest share of votes of any police and crime commissioner in that area. It just goes to show that anything is possible.
Your story begins with your childhood growing up in Nigeria. Can you explain how you and your family came to settle in the UK when you were 13 years old?
Well, Dad was a politician in Nigeria, and having won an election, I know there was a real political instability at the time. A military dictator came into power and all the elections were overruled. So Dad came to England and we came to join him, my twin sister and I and my mum. And that was quite a culture shock for us. I mean, we lived in a pretty affluent environment. We were very comfortable. To now living in a two-bedroom flat, 4 of us with another family of 4, so 8 of us, in a 2-bedroom flat in Upton Park. Quite a contrast. And
your dad became an immigrant, holding down 3 jobs.
As a cleaner, yes.
To make ends meet. Did it hurt his pride?
Absolutely. You know, but the thing that actually taught me was that so long as you're working hard and you're willing to put in the effort, you've got to do what you've got to do to provide for your family, despite the difficulties. And sometimes you've got to start at the bottom, and that's okay.
I just want to talk a bit more about your politics. You stood for election as an MP in West Ham in 2015. Why is it, do you think, that ethnically diverse people in the UK, that 64% of them, according to the recent polling, shows that they vote Labour and 20% vote Conservative?
I think there's some generational aspect to this, where people tend to vote the way their parents voted. So it's no surprise to me that when first-generation migrants come to the UK, they sometimes see the Labour Party as the party of the working people.
When Kwasi Kwarteng was Chancellor, a Labour MP called him superficially black because he was a Tory. What did that instant make you feel as a black Conservative?
That was exceptionally disgusting. It was exceptionally, in my view, racist and stereotyping in the worst way, because it was suggesting that to be black, you have to be able to speak a certain way. To be black, you cannot go to Eton or Oxford or the top schools in the world because that's not what black people do. I thought was reprehensible.
The Sewell report, which examined racial disparities in the UK, got into hot water when it appeared to conclude that UK society wasn't institutionally racist. What was your take on that?
I can hand on heart say, personally, the colour of my skin has never prevented me from achieving anything I wanted to achieve in this country. That said, there is no question in my mind that there are racist individuals out there. I get the abuse from some of these on social media. There is one that might be coming in the public domain in months to come in terms of the racial abuse and that I've received.
What do you mean?
Well, I won't be able to go into too much detail about it.
But you've had to complain about it.
It was quite a serious one.
Right.
You know, with threats to my family. It was quite a serious one.
OK.
Quite a serious one. But
I'm
look,
sorry. I'm sorry you've suffered that.
You know, Diane Abbott faces this. You know, David Lammy faces this. Kwasi, as you just mentioned, faces. Kemi faces this. You know, Rishi now is facing it. You know, it's unfortunately, there are some people in Britain who do not like to see people with this different skin colour in positions of influence and power.
Boris Johnson has written in the past, and I know it was a long time ago, but he did talk about pickaninnies and watermelon smiles. Did that trouble you?
I think he might have apologized for those. If you were to ask him again if he will use those same language in another book, I'm sure he probably wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
But personally, I don't think there's any room for that kind of language. It's not something that I would.
Well, look,
endorse.
let's get back to you. Let's stop talking about all these other politicians. Let's
That's
talk about
fine.
a potential
We can
future
talk about them as well.
politician. You are, as I said, the first black police and crime officer. You yourself have been stopped and searched, I think, at least 6 times.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah. 3 times in London when I was growing up here. Once in Hertfordshire, once in Buckinghamshire, and once in Bedfordshire.
I wanted to ask you, like, has it happened to your sons? Do you worry for your sons?
Thankfully, it hasn't happened to any of my children yet. But the thing is this, I have used, because I trained to be a special constable with Bedfordshire Police before I became a police and crime commissioner. And I got to see for myself firsthand how the powers are used. I got to see the necessity of it, and it's something that we need, the police need to have in their arsenal in keeping our communities safe. But it's a blunt tool.
So you support it, though?
I support the appropriate use of it.
Right.
And the justifiable use of it.
Do you think it's used inappropriately often,
Sometimes, without question, of course.
OK.
When I was, I think, 19 years old.
Yeah.
I was coming from basketball practice in Whitechapel, and I got stopped, and I asked the officer, why did you stop me? And he said to me, just to make sure you're not one of London's most wanted. That was it.
How did that make you feel? Were you angry?
At the time, I didn't really care because I knew a lot of my friends dealt with that. But the older I got, knowing what I know now, I'm like, well, that was just wrong. There was no need for that. I just would love to see policing also understand how its coercive powers have an impact on people who are most affected by it as well. I mean,
someone called you a traitor when you took this job. Was that... Was it painful for you, but did you understand why? Can you understand?
No, I couldn't understand why. Absolutely not. I mean, you know, I'm a conservative because I want to be. I know my history as a black person. I know the history of this country. I'm not in denial of it. I welcome and celebrate the good, but, you know, of course, I have to accept they're not very good as well. But the Conservative Party is not a monolithic group. For someone to give me grief just because I'm in one political party and they think the colour of my skin should not fit into that political party, I think it's just
Or was
wrong.
it because people feel that the police is institutionally racist and it's disproportionately targeting young black men in stop and search, etc., so people are mistrustful?
Well, I mean, I've been called traitor for that as well, you know, but, you know, my thing is this. I feel very passionate about law and order, but there are those who, like Carrick, who really are a total shame to the uniform that they wear. But I'm here because I want to make policing better for all of our communities.
In London, where you grew up, black Londoners make up 13% of the capital's total population, yet account for 45% of London's knife murder victims and 61% of knife murder perpetrators and 53% of knife crime perpetrators. Yeah.
This is a very controversial one because there are some people who would say, well, stop picking on black people, whatever it is, but the evidence is what it is. You can't, the numbers don't lie. I think there are issues that need addressing as a community, but it won't be addressed by people finger pointing, oh, well, there you go, because you're black, you're more likely to be killed, so I'm going to stop you more for any reason, whether you like it or not. I think we need to try to find the right balance here. This is one of the reasons why I choose, at some cost to me and my family, to be as public as I am. And it's because I want those young men to see that, whether they're black or white, whatever the case might be, that, you know, you can come from a council estate and be where I am today. Yes, you can be a football player. Yes, you can be a musician or be a Stormzy or you could be a burner boy, whatever it is you want to be. You can be whatever you want to be, you know. But the reality is this: there is an underworld that is driving a lot of this violence in our community, which we don't really talk about as well, which does not have the racial dimensions or the racial narrative, which is the use of drugs. You know, a lot of the stabbings, a lot of the violence are driven by the demand for drugs in Britain, which is phenomenal. And, you know, I would love to see more police resources being used in dealing with this demand side that is also driving this violence in our communities as well.
So you think that not enough resources put into this area because it is young black boys who are suffering rather than middle-class white boys?
That's a tricky one. And I would not want to assume motive, but I see that a lot of effort is going around enforcement on those who sell and who deal, but a lot less goes on dealing with the users. A huge amount of resource goes into enforcement for those who are selling, but very, very little goes into dealing with the demand.
As opposed to the middle-class richies taking cocaine?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And where there's a demand, there will be a supply.
OK. So you think that that is unfair?
I think it's something that needs to be looked at.
I need to ask you about the David Carrick case this week. I know he was a Met officer, but the case surely has ramifications for all forces.
Massively.
He's not one bad apple, is he? He's part of a culture. How much do you think it undermines the police?
When I was giving evidence before the Home Affairs Select Committee, I said that I am tired of hearing this line of one bad apples. We need to stop talking about that. Quite rightly, and damn right, the public expect there to be no bad apples. But in the real world, policing, because of the nature of what it is, will unfortunately attract people who have ulterior motives. And if they can get through that system, they will be able to manifest those things.
How worried are you that a man with his record could join the police force, maintain it over many years, despite all the signs he was violent and intimidating?
Had been vetted as well several times.
And he'd been vetted several times.
But the solution can't be just about vetting alone, because clearly, as we can see from this Carrick case, people who have been vetted still get through, despite evidence. But we need to also have a situation whereby people who complain within policing or externally are taken more seriously, and this is looked into. So in Bedfordshire now, since I became PCC, about 7 officers have been dismissed.
So are you confident that this couldn't happen in your police force?
I would be dishonest if I was to say that that could never happen, because, like I said, we've got 7 officers who have been dismissed. There are now, I think, about 27 live cases that they're still investigating for Bedfordshire alone. But not all of them are like rapes or there could be all kinds of different issues, misogyny, racism, you name it. 27 live cases. 27 live cases. But what I choose to do as a police and crime commissioner, which many other PCCs are doing, is that I'm holding my chief constable accountable every single month for this. He spends time on the front line with the officers, he gets to pick up things, and already we are seeing the benefit of that.
Finally, do you think that having a Prime Minister from an ethnic minority, Rishi Sunak, our first ethnic minority and Hindu Prime Minister, a massive achievement, do you think it makes it easier or harder for the Conservative Party to win an election under him? I
think ultimately it will be the economy that decides what people think, how people feel in their pockets, in their bank account. In terms of his ethnicity and encouraging others, I think sometimes in this country, you know, Beth, we understate the really, really good thing that's happening here. You know, when Barack Obama became the first black president, everybody was up and up with it. Everybody loved it. It was a great thing. But when we have the first, brown-skinned, prime minister ever in this country, what's the big deal? You know, I think we talk down this country a bit too much and some of our major achievements. I think we should celebrate Britain a lot more than we do. OK, well, Festus, thank you so much for giving me your time today. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you. Pleasure.
Festus Akinbusoye there. Now, remember that name, because I'm sure that one day Westminster will come calling for that particular gentleman. Now, if you scan this QR code on screen now, you can watch all of our interviews online and all of the previous episodes of the show. And if you scan the QR code on screen here, you can listen to the Beth Rigby Interviews podcast. A new episode's available now. Each week I take a look at the highlights of the interviews, have a chat about the political week. So there's some extra bits and pieces in there too. That's on the Sky News app or wherever you get your podcasts. Well, that's all for today's show. Thank you so much to my guests, Festus and Lord Winston, and thank you all for watching.